Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining. We'll just give it one more moment while everyone else joins. Okay. Okay, we might get started. So thank you everyone for joining today's FORS webinar, Smart Strategies for Cutting Fuel Costs. We're joined by Geraint Davis, FORS Director, and Mike Johnson from the Fuel Experts at Portland. We do have time for a Q&A at the end of the webinar, so please pop your questions in the chat function or the Q&A, and we'll get to them at the end. And if we don't, we'll follow up via email. We also have 2 polls at the moment in the chat function, so please fill the polls out. Your feedback is very valuable to us. And over to Mike to get started. Thank you.
Thanks, Holly. Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for joining. I'm Mike Johnson. I'm the director at Portland Analytics. We're a specialist fuel consultancy. I'll go through a little bit more detail on what we do in a second. I'm joined by Geraint. I'll just pass over to let him introduce himself.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us here today for this, of all, I find it a very exciting subject, buying fuel. It was one of my main roles in my former role as COO at John Raymond Transport, where I was for 22 years. I've been FORS director now for the last couple of years. We're going to discuss the trials and tribulations of buying fuel in various different ways, and hopefully help you, the operators, save some money along the way.
It's great. So just briefly run through the agenda. Like I say, we'll talk a little bit about Portland Analytics and what we do. Going to start by just giving an overview of price structure in the UK. Obviously, regardless of how you're actually buying your fuel, it's all priced in a similar way from a basis price level. So I'll go through the structure there, and then a section on some specific kind of tips tailored towards both bulk buying and fuel card buying. So as Holly mentioned, there is a chat function. If you want to put any kind of specialist questions in the chat that are specific to the way that you're buying fuel, please feel free. And like I say, we'll try and tailor it to each purchase method. And then there's a short section at the end just on options available to mitigate risk. So how to protect yourself against exposure in fuel markets. Just start with an introduction to Portland Analytics. So we've been a FORS affinity partner since November 2023. We are, as I say, a specialist fuel consultancy. So our primary business offering is we work with companies that buy fuel on a commercial basis to do so more effectively. So our key kind of method to do that is we offer fuel procurement reviews, and we put together procurement strategies for fuel buyers. That might look like a managed tender service. So if we do an assessment of your fuel procurement and think that it could be improved by a managed tender, then we'll go to market on your behalf. We do a lot around alternative fuels transition. So some of you may have been a part of the HVO webinar that we did over summer, which we're planning on doing a kind of updated version again in the next couple of months. We also do training, so fuel procurement training, helping your buying departments understand how to purchase more effectively, and a bit of market reporting as well. You might also know us as the now former owner of Portland Pricing. It's an online platform for showing kind of transparent fuel pricing in the UK. We recently sold that business, but we're very much still partnered with the company that owns it. And we are part of the wider Portland group. So initially started out as a fuel hedging provider, offering fixed prices to fuel buyers, branched out into physical fuel supply. Basically, every element of the downstream fuel industry, Portland are involved in it in some way or another. So if I just start by going through some pricing mechanisms, like I say, this is going to be relevant when we talk about the specifics of bulk and fuel card buying. But just to give you a bit of an overview of the UK price structure and how it all works to begin with. So Fuel pricing in the UK is based on traded prices for Northwest Europe. So the key kind of trading region for Europe is Amsterdam, Rotterdam, Antwerp. So trades of fuel that go through in that region basically set the price for the whole of Northwest Europe, including the UK. Now, there are companies that exist, such as S&P Global Platts, who you probably just know as just Platts, and Argus Media. They publish daily prices for a variety of fuel grades, and that is based on the trades that happen in the ARA region. So those published prices are then used by wholesalers. So that's anybody either refining in the UK or importing fuel into the UK on a wholesale basis. And they use that those published prices as the basis for their fuel pricing. So that filters its way down the supply chain to you guys as end users. So effectively, the prices that you pay for your fuel at the pump or delivered into your tank on site, they're all based on trade settlement data for the Northwest European market. And just a point at the end there that fuel products are usually traded in dollars per ton. So the prices are published in dollars per ton, which means that as a UK buyer, you're also exposed to movement in the exchange rate. So the weaker the pound is against the dollar, the more expensive fuel becomes in the UK because all prices are published on a dollar per ton basis. So in terms of what that looks like for UK market pricing, this is a very simplified version of what the price structure actually looks like. There are more bells and whistles to it, but broadly speaking, you can split the basis price calculation into three key elements. So you have the base price, so that's the price of the actual fossil product itself. So you know, for the majority of you guys, that will be diesel. So you can see here I took prices for the end of Feb. So the base price at the end of Feb was 47.5 pence per litre, and that's just for the raw cost of diesel itself. You've then got the cost of meeting biofuels obligations in the UK. So there is a piece of legislation called the RTFO, which is the Renewable Transport Fuel Obligation. And to put it simply, the RTFO dictates that a certain percentage of your litre of diesel has to be made up of renewable biodiesel. Now, that percentage changes year on year, but obviously there is a cost to do that. There's a cost to blend that biodiesel into your fossil product to create your kind of road going biodiesel. And there are sub obligations within the main kind of piece of legislation, such as the DFO, which is the Development Fuel Obligation. All packaged up together, that currently accounts for roughly just under 7 pence per litre. And then the big chunk on top, obviously, is duty. So pay just under 53 pence per litre duty for road diesel in the UK, which is obviously quite a significant chunk, roughly 50% of the total fuel price. And those three elements make up the base price of fuel in the UK. On top of that, you're going to pay a supply premium, which obviously depends based on the way you're actually buying fuel. So you pay one supply premium for bulk, one supply premium for fuel card, for example. But in terms of the kind of core elements, those three elements, the base price, the cost of RTFO and duty, are standard across all fuel that you would buy in the UK. So just move on to the next slide. So in terms of the premiums that you would pay on top of that base price, as I say, they vary depending on the way that you're buying fuel. The most cost-effective way to buy fuel is to get it into a bulk tank on site. And it's the most cost-effective because there are fewer steps in the supply chain. So what I've done on this slide is just tried to give you a bit of a flavour of what would make up your supply premium depending on the way that you're buying. So as you can see, from a bulk perspective, there are relatively few elements to the supply premium. You have the cost to pick up the product at the rack. So by rack, I mean refinery or storage location. You've then got the cost of transporting it into site, so it's just the haulage cost for each load, and then you've got the supplier's margin on top of that. With bunker, so bunker would be basically buying physical fuel into a card network. I'll go into a bit more detail on that further on in the presentation. Effectively, you've got the same costs, but you also have to pay the card network a handling fee to access the sites on that network. And then if you are buying on a pure fuel card basis, as you can see, you have all the same costs because the card provider has to pay to get that fuel into the network. They have to pay the network provider the handling fee, and then they also add their margin on top of that as well. So because there are more elements to it, obviously fuel card is the more expensive option. Not always, because if you're buying on bulk in very small quantities into quite remote locations, for example, your haulage costs might outweigh that of a fuel card. But generally speaking, this is kind of what goes into the premiums for each of the purchase methods. And then this next slide, again, just focused on kind of base price movement. So I just wanted to show you the movement in the wholesale price of diesel over the last just over 12 months, last 15 months. This goes back to the start of January 2024. So as you can see, it's been a relatively flat market compared to previous years. There's still been a bit of volatility here. So just kind of talk you through some key points. The first kind of quarter of 2024, you can see that prices were higher than they are now, and that was mainly due to restrictions around supply. So things like the conflict in the Red Sea that caused supply issues, and obviously extends supply chain, increases the price. But broadly speaking, through the second half of last year, prices declined, and that is mainly due to low demand. So even in a year where we've seen quite a lot of geopolitical crisis and conflict around the world, prices have remained suppressed, which just shows you how much this demand piece is kind of weighing on things. Ordinarily, if demand was higher, you'd see much bigger price shocks when there's conflict in the Middle East, for example. But they're relatively short-lived at the moment, and it is just because demand is low. Just kind of a couple of other key points on this chart. So obviously you can see a bit of a spike here in January. So the dark blue line is the wholesale cost of diesel. The light blue line is the cost of B7 diesel. So that's diesel with the RTFO applied to it. You can see there was a spike here in January, and that was due to the kind of final round of sanctions introduced by the Biden administration on Russia just before obviously things went across to Trump. And then also point out this spike here. So I mentioned the cost of RTFO, so the cost of meeting the biofuel obligation in the UK. You can see that there was a big spike in November of last year, and that was actually due to a bit of a perfect storm of a lot of refineries closed down, so particularly on the HVO side. So HVO is used as a tool to meet these kind of obligations across Europe. A lot of HVO refineries all shut down at the same time in November, which meant supply was very tight. If supply is tight on one kind of biofuel that's used to meet obligations, it drags up the cost of all of the others. So even though we're not using HVO to meet our bio obligations in the UK at the moment, it's still pushed up the price of bio, which caused this kind of big spike in November there. But yeah, broadly speaking, prices are relatively low at the moment, and that's due to, like I say, fairly low demand. So in terms of pricing periods, they do vary depending on the way that you're actually buying your fuel. So by pricing period, I'm talking about when a supplier calculates their price. As I say, they will be using published wholesale price data to do that. And they either do it on a daily basis or on a weekly basis. So a daily lagged would be, they'll take the published wholesale price for the previous day or the day before that, which is a D1 and D2 mechanism. Or they'll take an average of wholesale prices across the previous week, which is referred to as a weekly lagged mechanism. Daily lagged, you're more likely to see that on a bulk purchasing basis. Weekly lagged, you can see that on both a fuel card, where you get your prices through weekly, and on a contracted bulk arrangement as well. And then the third option is obviously the spot market. So that's just uncontracted, the live market that moves throughout the day, which Geraint will talk to you a little bit about his experiences purchasing on spot in a sec. But yeah, certain suppliers will use different lags. So I mentioned a weekly lag, which is an average of the previous week. Some suppliers might use a week -2 lag. So that's the average from not the previous week, but the week before. And that's to reflect the fact that supply chains have got longer in the last few years. So, you know, a lot of European diesel came from Russia before the Russia-Ukraine conflict. To get a cargo from Russia to Northwest Europe would take a couple of days. To get a cargo now, you know, if it's not coming from Russia, your options are, you know, the US Gulf Coast, for example, which is more like a 10 days to 2 week transportation time. So some suppliers have just reflected that kind of longer supply chain in the way that they price. So you might see a week -2 lag as a mechanism as well. And I think in terms of tips, this is probably the first one. If you're able to have different options that have different lags, you can use that to your advantage. And I'll just show you what that looks like on the next slide. So this chart shows you just a comparison of, again, on a wholesale basis, daily lag prices, so D1 and D2, and weekly lag prices on week 1 and week 2 basis. And you can see, I mean, the main thing I'm just going to kind of point out on this chart is that they move around a lot. So 1 week you might be better off buying on a daily lagged price. The next week you might be better off buying on a weekly lag price. And that's because, for example, if the market is falling on a daily basis and you're buying on a weekly price that's set on last week's average, obviously your daily price is going to be lower because it's filtering through after 1 day rather than having to wait for the next week's pricing to come through. However, in a rising market, obviously the reverse is true. So if you can get options to buy on both mechanisms, and where clearly there'll be things like volume contracts that you need to meet, so it's slightly more difficult to just chop and change. But if you're able to set up arrangements with different suppliers where you've got different pricing options to choose from, then you can use it to your advantage and make a decision each week based on which price you're going to go for. So I think with that, Geraint, I know that you were going to, I don't know if you wanted to maybe chip in on that bit. I know we've got a slide for you a bit later on. Didn't know if you wanted to comment there.
Yeah, it's that is of relevance, because if you do commit to a certain amount of volume, then and you've got contracted work and that sort of thing, you still need to be buying a little bit on the spot market because you are committed to that volume over a period of time. So if it's 1 tanker a week or something like that, I'll elaborate on how I used to buy fuel in the next couple of slides. But once you've made that commitment, and you're stuck with it really. So you've got to, and it could be a commitment of volume through putting it into your own diesel tanks or on fuel cards.
Right. So this section is more on the kind of specific tips for each of the purchasing methods. So I've split it into bulk and fuel card. As I say, there is a short section on bunkering within the fuel card part as well. But yeah, I mean, please feel free to put questions in the chat as we go through this section. So if I start with bulk buying, and as Geraint mentioned, spot versus contract. You know, I think it's basically it's handy to be able to have options on both. But by contract, I'm referring to you have a fixed volume commitment with a supplier, and in exchange for that, they'll give you a fixed premium above the wholesale price. That might be based on the daily or weekly wholesale price. As I've mentioned, generally speaking, it would be on a weekly basis. But yeah, contract, there are pros and cons to both. So spot buying obviously is where you ring up suppliers for their price for a delivery into tank. You might ring round 3 to 5 suppliers and go with the one that's got the cheapest price. And again, that gives you some flexibility there. But there are pros and cons to buying on spot versus contract. So I've kind of listed them here. So if I go through the pros and cons of spot to begin with, pros, you're not contracted to a single supplier, so you have the option to go elsewhere. If you don't like the price that one supplier is giving you, you can ring somebody else and get another one. And that also means that you can spread your credit limit across multiple suppliers. So you know, if prices are high, and you've got a couple of loads placed with one supplier and a relatively short credit limit there, you've got the option, if you've got a credit line with another supplier, to ring them up and place an order elsewhere, and it just allows you to spread that credit around. And as I say, you can take advantage of a falling live market. So as I say, a weekly price is based on a week's average. So actually, if you had 1 week where the price was relatively flat, but say for the sake of example, on a Wednesday, there was a big dip in the middle of the day, and then it rose back to where it was, your weekly price is just going to look flat. However, if you were able to buy on the spot market at that time, you'd be able to take advantage of that midweek dip, just to give you an example there. However, there are cons to buying on that method. So no guarantee of supply. If supply is limited and you're ringing round spot suppliers for a price, there are two things that are going to happen, or one of two things that could happen. Firstly, you might not be able to get the stock, because if supply is limited, the contract customers are always going to be favoured by the supplier first, because they obviously have a contractual obligation to fulfil, which they don't have for spot buyers. Or if they do have stock available, it might be limited, and therefore you will see higher premiums than you would see obviously on a contracted basis. So there are pros and cons to both. I'd say the main pro with spot is the flexibility and that ability to take advantage of dips in the market. From a contract perspective, the main pros are security of supply. So as I say, if there's a shortage, suppliers will always fulfill their contracts first. So you can basically guarantee that you're not going to run dry. And a fixed premium as well. So whilst you can't control what's happening in the wholesale market, you can control the premium above the wholesale price. And you can lock that in place for 12 months, 2 years with certain suppliers, and it just gives you that guarantee that you're not having to ring around for various prices, which you don't know how they're going to correspond with the wholesale price. You're always going to buy at a fixed premium above that wholesale price. But in terms of cons, as Geraint said, you have to commit to your volume. So if you're contracting volume, if you don't fulfill it, then there might be penalties that you have to pay at the end of the contract. So that's one to be aware of. You can't obviously take advantage of intraday dips, and all of your credit sits with one supplier. So once you use up that credit limit, you either have to clear your invoices or have shorter payment terms, for example. So there are pros and cons to both, but again, from a contracted perspective, if you're not wanting to go to the hassle of ringing around suppliers and monitoring that live market throughout the day, then it's the easiest option, and you know that you're getting a fixed premium above the wholesale price. So again, on bulk, another thing to consider is location. So your product costs and your transport costs are going to vary depending on where the product is coming from and how far it's got to travel to get to your site. So your product cost itself, so that's the cost of actually buying the fuel at the rack, so from the refinery or from a terminal, that varies. So it varies based on location. If you've got an inland supply terminal, chances are the cost might be slightly higher because the fuel's had to be transported by truck or pipe or whatever to get to that site, versus a coastal location or a refinery direct. And then you've got the cost of actually taking it from the rack, the storage location, or the refinery to your site, and that is just based on a haulage cost, so pound per mile. And this is a relatively simple calculation, but it just shows you that the most cost-effective way of buying bulk fuel is to get a full load, which is a 36,000 litre load, and that's because the haulage cost is going to remain the same to get from A to B, so refinery to site. However, you're spreading it across a higher volume, so as a pence per litre cost, it obviously, it reduces it. So I've just done an example here based on a £500 load to get your delivery from the refinery to your site. If you get it at 36,000 litres, it equates to 1.39 pence per litre. Obviously, you're doubling that if you're only getting a half load. So that's just a kind of simplistic example that illustrates the way that haulage costs and distance will affect the price that you pay in pence per litre. A couple of other things to just point out. This map, obviously, it's not exactly geographically accurate, but I'll just point out some kind of key supply points. So obviously you've got the Humber, which clearly has been in the news over the last day or two, due to the tanker issue there. But there are two refineries on the Humber. So you've got Lindsey Oil Refinery, which is owned and operated by Prax, and you then got Immingham, which is operated by Phillips 66. And there's obviously a lot of storage around there as well, which is the nature of having two refineries close to one another. And then on the other opposite side of the country, in the northwest, you've got Stanlow Refinery, which is operated by SR, and again, quite a lot of storage there. If you look at the kind of Thames area here, you can see that there's a lot of storage, and that's because of obviously the proximity to the ARA region that I mentioned before. So a lot of product is coming into the UK and being stored on the Thames there. And then another kind of key region is in the Midlands, where you've got quite a lot of key storage points there. So obviously there's no refining infrastructure in the inland UK. However, certainly around the Midlands, there's an awful lot of storage, which means that it can be quite competitive if you're closely located to that. So I think the tip here is make an assessment, try and find out where your fuel is actually coming from based on where your site is located. And if you notice that it's coming from a storage site 100 miles from your tank location, then it might be worth looking for a more regional option. And if you focus on the areas that I've mentioned where there is a lot of storage or a lot of refining activity, then again those areas can be more competitive. So it might be worth buying from a supplier that can pull from one of those locations, even if it has to travel a little bit further. It's very much a subjective way of buying. Oh, sorry, I've skipped something there. Yeah, it's entirely subjective depending on your circumstances. Where is your site located? But I just wanted to kind of give a little bit of an overview of how transport costs and supply locations can affect your premiums. Another issue linked to where product comes from is temperature accounting. So temperature accounting basically fuel contracts and expands depending on how warm it is. So the warmer fuel is, the more it expands, so the more liters you're getting. But to account for that, there is a method of temperature accounting that suppliers will use called standard temperature accounting, and that is where they invoice you based on what the product would be at a standardized temperature of 15 degrees. So you might get hotter product delivered, and therefore you're getting more liters, but you're only being invoiced for what the product would be at 15 degrees. So in some circumstances, you can get a little bit more bang for your buck when you're buying on a method of standard temperature accounting if the product is delivered hot. The alternative, which you'll see this when you consult your contracts, the alternative is called measured or ambient temperature accounting, which is just the volume at which it's loaded onto the tanker when they load up at the rack. Now, obviously, there's quite a bit of stock gain and loss that you can see from this chart here. So the chart shows you the number of liters that you would be invoiced for on standard temperature accounting, based on the ambient temperature down the side here. So as you can see, as it gets cooler, you're being invoiced for more liters because you're paying for something at what it would be at 15 degrees, so more product, but it's obviously shrinking the cooler the temperature gets. So again, this is entirely subjective, again, depending on where your product comes from. I think the key thing is that it will be specified in your contract. So it's worth checking that contract to make sure that you're on the correct method of temperature accounting for you. I think as a general rule, if you're receiving product that's hot, and you're being charged on measured or ambient liters, so product might be hot if it comes direct from a refinery, you're charged at what that is loaded onto the tanker at. So if it's hot and it's expanded when it goes onto the tanker, by the time it gets to your tank and it sits there and cools down, you're going to actually lose some stock. So that's where it's kind of important to look at this sort of thing. If you're receiving hot product, then it might be more beneficial for you to buy on a standard temperature accounting basis. Most contracts will probably be on measured. So again, it's just something to look at and work out which is the right option for you. In terms of contract price structure, again, some things to look out for when you're consulting your bulk supply contract. So this is for any operators that are actually buying on a contracted basis. As I mentioned, the base price structure in the UK is standardized. There is an industry standard that basically all suppliers will use, which means that when you compare premiums above that wholesale price, you're basically comparing like for like. However, in practice, it doesn't actually work like that because there are certain areas within that basis price calculation where suppliers will add costs, and that you need to kind of dig into that when you're looking at contract offers to make sure there aren't any hidden costs in your in the basis price mechanism. So I've got some examples on here. So the first one, $1 per ton product premium. So as I say, when you get an offer through, you're looking at the pence per litre cost above the wholesale price and you're comparing that with what other suppliers are giving you. There might be $1 per ton premium also hidden in the basis price calculation, and that's where they take the published Platts rate, for example, and they add a small dollar per ton premium in there. So that's one to look out for. Another one, which is far more common than that, is a biofreight charge. So the published price reference for the cost of biodiesel, so the cost of meeting the RTFO, is it's based on a European price index excluding transport to the UK. So what some suppliers will do is add on a biofreight charge to account for the cost of transport to the UK. Those biofreight charges do vary by supplier, and you need to work out what they equate to in pence per litre. and add that onto the premium offer that you're getting to make sure that you're comparing apples with apples. And then finally, there are it's becoming a little bit more common to see storage costs in there as well. So I won't go into loads of detail on this because it's another legislative piece, but basically fuel suppliers are obliged by the government to hold a bit of stock in storage, and there is a cost of doing that, which they've started to pass through to end users within contract supply. So again, those prices are usually published in dollars per ton, and it's all about making sure that you're converting them all into pence per litre, adding them onto the premium offer, and just treating it as a all-in premium when you're doing your comparisons of offers from suppliers. So yeah, as I've put there, it's making sure you're comparing apples with apples, and just consulting your contracts and your offers to make sure there are no hidden costs within that. So I've talked quite a bit. Geraint's done a lot of buying on a bulk basis, so I'll let him talk through his experiences for a bit now.
That's brilliant, Mike. Thanks for that. Some really exciting and interesting stuff there, and a lot that goes on behind the scenes. There's a real science to it. So just to set the scene, as many of you will know, I worked for a haulage company for 22 years, and for a large amount of time at John Raymond Transport, part of the Nolan Group, were a Force Gold operator. I was responsible for buying the fuel. So just to set the scene then, had just north of 100 trucks, all 44 ton, 6x2 tractor units, all pull-in curtain-sided trailers throughout the UK. 2 sites that had fuel. One in Bridgend could hold 120,000 litres over 3 tanks, and there was a site at Cannock as well, which we had just about 42,000 litre tank, 2 tanks there. And the operation itself was probably 60 to 70% trampers, probably, but so I had to buy some fuel on bulk card, in bulk, in the tanks, and also on the cards as well. So as many of you will know, running a haulage business is a lifestyle. It's much more than a job. I'd have my phone with me on holiday, and I got quite obsessed with the spot market that Mike has alluded to earlier on. So I'd be at the side of the pool with my wife and the kids, and I'd be buying tankers of diesel, thinking that's entirely normal behaviour. It turns out it is not normal behaviour. But as you can imagine, running that number of vehicles, we did have a penchant for a drop of DERV and HVO more recently, for that matter, and bio blends. So in Bridgend, for example, we get through probably 2 to 3 road tankers a week, so that's a 36,500 full load of diesel, and then a Cannock, probably 2 to 3 a month. So we were buying a lot of fuel, or I was buying a lot of fuel. People talk, oh, I had a water cooler moment. I was talking with so-and-so at the water cooler. Well, I used to have diesel pump moments with the drivers, because I was that obsessed. So they'd be out with the diesel pumps and looking for ullage. Now, that is the word of the day, isn't it? Ullage. Ullage means how much you've got left in your tank. So there's so many things to consider. So say the spot market drops sufficiently, you think, right, I'm going to buy a couple of loads, credit permitting, which I'll touch on shortly. I'll put a splash in, I'll put 36,500 litres in, but then you've got to look at your empirical data, what your usage is, your historical data over the last couple of weeks, and have a rough idea of what you're going to use to, so very much sort of, how much diesel am I going to use in the next 24 hours? Can I get that load in tomorrow? And I've been like, oh, and then you use less than you think you have, then you try and push out the load to later in the day. But just to give you some context, okay, on the spot market, which, like I said, I became quite obsessed with it, really. I enjoyed the buzz of it, not just running a haulage company now, you're a commodities trader. Just to give you an idea, okay, 5p, if you save 5p in a litre of diesel, that would be £1,825 on a 36,500 litre load. So there's it's a big saving there. And like I said, I was getting through 2 to 3 a week in Bridgend, and 2 to 3 a month at Cannock. So there's always a but, though, isn't there? There's always a but. When the Ukraine war started back in early 2022, so I was overly reliant, if I'm honest, on the spot market, and I didn't have enough on contract. We've discussed the issues of contract earlier on. Obviously, you're bound to a price, and you sometimes working on a weekly lag price as well, and that sort of thing. So that became a challenge then, making sure that we had enough fuel to keep the wheels turning. And as I've already alluded to, we were 60%, 70% trampers, so that's long distance trucks. So they're not all going to be refueling in the yard, and they're going to have to put in some fuel up the road. And to have that policy where drivers are encouraged, without going off route, to use your own sites where possible for fuel and AdBlue, yeah, because you'll make some serious savings there rather than using the cards all the time. And buying, there's different models available for cards. You can have fixed price cards, weekly lag price cards. I had a particular card with a major oil company at one point, which was a fixed weekly lag price. So you, as Mike's already discussed, Platts. So suddenly become obsessed with the Platts price, and a lot of cards will be on a Platts plus, so it'll be Platts plus 3p, Platts plus 3.5, something like that, depending on the volume. The other way you could buy it, of course, is to have a fuel card company charge you a handling fee of so much pence per litre, and depending on the volume you're going to be putting through, and put diesel, what we used to call put diesel into the pipe. So if the market drops, you might put 20,000 litres or 30,000 litres into stock. I used to buy off Portland amongst others, and we used to put that stock into the pipe. And of course, this is all credit permitting. You might have a fan-dabby-dozy price with a particular supplier, and then realize that you haven't got the credit, or you've got to make sure you've got the cash flow then to be able to bring a payment forward. 100k credit might sound a lot, but it's barely 2 loads of diesel. So it depends on the size of your fleet, of course. So there's a lot of things to consider. Yeah, back to you, Mike.
That's great. Thanks, Geraint. It's great to get your experiences. I mean, particularly hearing about you buying diesel at the side of the pool. I'm sure that my wife would be absolutely livid with me if I was trying to pull that one. But so we talked about bulk. I'll talk about fuel card a little bit here. As Geraint mentioned, there are different ways of buying on a fuel card as well. Again, so rather than spot versus contract, you get fixed and floating margins. So a fixed margin, as Geraint says, is based on a fixed premium above the Platts price or the published wholesale price. And that means that it's not going to change. So you might negotiate a 12-month fixed premium agreement, which means that you're buying it, for example, 3p above the wholesale price. There are also floating prices where they're not pegged back to the wholesale price. So sometimes they're going to be cheaper, sometimes they're going to be more expensive. However, unlike buying on the spot market, you can't take advantage of like an intraday dip in the market with fuel card, because fuel cards are just priced on a weekly basis. What you might see is, unfortunately, some fuel card sellers have kind of got a bit of a reputation for called margin creep, where they'll give you a really attractive price to begin with. You get switched over to them, but it's not on a fixed basis; it's on a floating basis, and you'll just start to see, so you start to see that margin widen as time goes on. You'll get using on the attractive price, and then 2 months down the line, it starts to widen. The chart on the right-hand side here is just an example of that. A very exaggerated example, as it's only over an 8-week period, but you can see the grey line follows the wholesale market, which is the dotted line. The floating line, at one point it's lower, it's more attractive, it's closer to the wholesale price. However, as time goes on, the margin widens and it becomes a less competitive price. And then you end up in a scenario where you're just moving from one supplier to another to take advantage of their more attractive introductory rates, a bit like buying your broadband, something like that. It's much easier to just negotiate a fixed premium agreement, because again, you know what you're buying above the wholesale price and you've got that certainty. And then the other piece on fuel card, as Geraint touched on, what you refer to it as putting it in the pipe. So that's bunkering. Bunkering, basically, the way that a card reseller works, so a company that sells you a UK Fuels or a Key Fuels card, they have a suspense account that they hold with the network operator, or a virtual stock account. Each week they'll go to a physical fuel supplier who's got an agreement with the network to actually go and put fuel into the network, into physical holes in the ground. So the card reseller will buy some fuel from that supplier. That'll sit in their suspense account, and then you as their customers will draw that fuel down on your cards, and it'll just trickle out of their suspense account. The network, so UK Fuels or Key Fuels, will charge the reseller a handling fee. So they're paying for the fuel into the network, and then they're paying a handling fee to the network operator. As I mentioned right at the beginning, they also add their margin on top of that as well. So you can cut out part of that if you've got the volume. So you kind of need to be using, I would say, at least 10,000 litres a week to warrant moving across to a bunker, a bunkering kind of arrangement. But you can actually do this yourself. So you set up a direct account with the network operator to have a suspense account. You then have a separate agreement with a fuel supplier to put in your 10,000 litres a week into your suspense account, and that's it. So you're just paying the supplier a premium on the weekly lagged fuel price, plus the network margin, but you don't have to pay any card reseller margin. So it is a more cost-effective way of buying on a fuel card. But obviously it involves setting up agreements with both a physical fuel supplier and the network operator. But if you're prepared to do that, there is margin saving in there, because you, like I say, you're eradicating a card reseller margin. So it's an option if you've got the volume there, and you're willing to go through the administrative kind of burden of actually getting that set up. And then just the final section, I'm just wary of time, and we want to leave a little bit of time for questions as well. But just a couple of slides on mitigating risk. And I think in terms of mitigating risk, so mitigating your exposure to movement in the cost of fuel, you really have two options. And those two options are long-term fixed pricing or using a fuel escalator. Really, it's kind of one or the other. You don't really need to do both. But if I start with long-term fixed pricing, so this refers to, rather than a fixed premium agreement, this is just fixing the whole cost of your fuel price for up to 12 months in advance. And you can do that in two ways. There is an option called a paper hedge, which means that it's completely detached from your physical fuel purchasing arrangement. So you just have an agreement with a hedging provider to settle. So you agree a fixed price, and then you have a monthly settlement where you basically assess the average price for the month versus the fixed price. If the average price was higher, you receive a credit from the hedging provider, and therefore you basically getting back what you've overspent on above your fixed price. If it's lower, you would be invoiced by the supplier. So again, you're paying out the difference between the lower price and the fixed price. And it's a budgetary tool. It's not a method of beating the market. It's being able to say, right, my budget for fuel this year is £1.10 a litre, for example. Lock that in for 12 months, and you're not trying to beat the market. So if the fuel price is is lower than £1.10 a litre, obviously that means you're going to be paying out on your hedge, but you still have the budget certainty. Clearly, if the market goes up, then your hedge is in the money and you have saved money. The important thing with paper hedging, and this is really important, is to make sure that it ties up with the way that you're actually buying your physical fuel. So I've talked about, and a lot of the charts that I've showed you have got the wholesale cost of diesel, and then another line that's the B7 price of diesel. So that's the RTFO compliant price. You want to make sure that that's the price that you're hedging. So if you've taken out a paper hedge, if you don't have RTFO included, for example, then you're leaving yourself, it was a 7p part of the price that I showed you right at the start. It's a 7p exposure that you're leaving yourself, and obviously that can move. So it's important, if you're doing it on a paper basis, to make sure that all of the costs within your actual physical price structure are reflected in your hedge. So that's kind of the key point on this one. The alternative, which is far more simple to do administratively, is some suppliers will just offer you a fixed price for your contracted fuel supply. So you can literally just get X loads a month delivered into tank at a price that you agree 12 months in advance. And it means that your hedge is just wrapped up in your physical supply agreement. So it's a much simpler way of doing it, but it does mean that you obviously, you're then limited to having to get your fixed price through your physical fuel supplier. Obviously doing it on the paper hedge gives you that flexibility to still be able to go and buy fuel from wherever you want. And then the other method, if you're not hedging, is to use a fuel escalator. So a fuel escalator basically allows you to vary your haulage rates based on movement in the cost of fuel. So what most operators will generally do is set like a monthly escalator mechanism, where they initially agree a base price for each haulage contract. So your haulage cost is fixed at X based on a diesel price of Y. That diesel price is then benchmarked against the actual diesel price each month, and the difference is then applied to the cost of haulage. The mechanism that's used actually is of your total haulage cost, only a certain amount of that is attributed to the cost of fuel, so roughly 30 to 35%. So the difference in your base price and the monthly reference price is applied to the 35%, and then you apply that to your haulage rate. If you don't have one of these, and you're not going to go down the long-term fixed pricing mechanism, they're relatively easy to get set up. We can help you with the contract mechanism. It's a one-pager that just slots into your haulage agreement, and administratively very simple to actually put into place as well. But there's a chart here on the right hand side that kind of just shows you, if you don't have a surcharge in place and the cost of fuel goes up, it just eats into your haulage margin. So having an escalator in place just allows you to really transparently pass through the cost of increasing cost of fuel to your customers, and it's widely accepted. You're not going to be told to do one by your customers, because so many companies have a haulage rate, have a surcharge mechanism within their haulage contract. So yeah, it's a simple way of managing your exposure to fuel movements. So in terms of the key takeaways, this is the last slide before we go onto the Q&A. As I say, I've split it into the purchase mechanisms that we've talked about. So if you're buying on bulk, check what works for your business. Are you better off buying on a spot basis where you can sit by the pool and buy diesel, or on a contract basis where you've got a fixed premium agreement above the wholesale price? Have a look at where your fuel's coming from, because that can obviously affect your cost through either the cost of haulage or also this temperature accounting and the stock loss that might accompany it. And check your contracts for any hidden costs. Make sure when you're comparing offers that you've got all the elements of your fuel price in front of you and you're comparing apples with apples. That's really important. On a fuel card basis, fixed margin agreement, would that be more beneficial for your business, or are you happy to chop and change between different fuel cards on a week by week basis? If you're already on a fixed premium arrangement, the same applies in terms of your contracts. There might be add-ons within that base price calculation that you need to be aware of, so check that contract. And also, if your volume's high enough, would it be worth you moving on to a bunker model? And then you've got obviously those two pieces that we mentioned on managing your exposure. You got your two options there. And final kind of slide, so a little bit of a plug for our services. We're a fuel consultancy. Our main specialism is negotiating contracted supply agreements for commercial buyers and making sure that you're on the most beneficial purchase method for your business. We do that through an initial strategy. So we look at the way that you're currently buying fuel, and we basically prescribe an approach through like a short report that obviously we kind of give back to your business, present back to you, and yeah, we can help you implement that as well. We're offering FORS operators an initial 30-minute consultation where we just discuss the way you're currently buying fuel, what kind of ideas we would have to be able to help you reduce those costs. No obligation to do anything with us after that, but please feel free to get in contact with me if you'd like to set that up. As I say, that's a free offering for FORS operators, and I think that's it. So that's yeah, the Q&A. I can't actually see the questions, so Holly, I don't know if you're able to
Hello.
read some out.
Thanks, Mike. That was a really insightful presentation. We don't actually have any questions in the chat, so we have 4 minutes left. So if anyone wants to pop any messages in the chat function or in the Q&A, Mike will answer them. So Garrett, I don't know if you have any questions for Mike, or if you have anything that you think the operators would be interested in hearing from you.
Yeah, it's really insightful. Not the sexiest of subjects, but looking at the amount of money that you can save, it certainly can be. And you're looking at the different buying models and what's right. The thing is with fuel, there's not a one-size-fits-all option or solution. It's very much tailored to the individual operation as a location, type of operation, and indeed if you can put fuel tanks on the yard. And a very valid point that was raised there towards the end was the fuel surcharge as well. And some people have even linked AdBlue into that as well, because it is widely accepted by customers now. A lot of people do pass that on. So it is a very valid point. Any questions, anybody? And then
No questions are coming through. Oh, we've got one actually. Thank you. So how much of a margin for fuel would you recommend? We've recently come into possession of a 10,000 litre tank, which would last us 5 weeks as a fleet. What would you say is the sweet spot for fuel margin? Great question. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks. So on a 10,000 litre tank, you are limited in terms of obviously the load size that you can get in. So you're more likely to get a competitive price from a regional fuel distributor that operates a rigid tanker rather than a full 36,000 load tanker. As a result of that, your premium is going to be more expensive than you would be on a 36,000 litre tanker. However, it still could easily be cheaper than buying on a fuel card basis. I wouldn't be able to give you a steer on what type of margin you'd expect to pay, because it's totally dependent on where your site is located. And but what I would be able to do is, if you wanted to have a conversation about it, tell you which suppliers would be best to speak to in terms of getting you the most competitive price for that tank size and location.
And something just to add in on there with bulk tanks, make sure that you can get bunded tanks that have got bunds built into them, but very often you'll need a bund around that tank. So if that tank is breached or damaged in any way, somebody drives into it or something daft like that. So make sure it is in an area of the yard it's not likely to be damaged. And as well, interceptor tanks are something to consider as well. If you're near a water course, there's a lot of sort of hidden detail around having tanks on site as well. So something to consider.
Great, thanks both. Well, we might wrap up the webinar now as it's almost 10 a.m. So thank you so much both for your time and everyone for joining. The webinar will be circulated after this call, and Mike's details as well will be included in the email. So thank you very much.
Thanks,
We'll see you in the
everybody.
next
Thanks,
one.
everybody.
Bye,
Cheers, guys.
everyone.